I put a few things up there because I want you to get an idea of some of the things that John accomplishes. The book of John, give me that next screen because I don't remember exactly where we got started. I want to make sure that we understand the authorship. The author of the book of John never says his own name, so we don't have this moment where he says this is the gospel of John. But here's why we know that it's John, or at least the early church believed it. The author's one of the 12. Let's go back real quick. The author's one of the 12 original disciples. We know that based upon the internal evidence in the book. We also know he calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved, and he does it repeatedly. He also never mentions his own name in the book, which is odd because when he lists off the disciples, he skips John. It's like, why would you skip one of those 12 guys? Well, there's an internal evidence there that John is talking about himself. There's also these references in the in the upper room to the disciple whom Jesus loves, sitting close to Jesus and talking to Peter. And we know from other Gospels that Peter and John go to the tomb, and yet we've got the disciple whom Jesus loved doing that in the book of John. And so there's some of those things. So he never mentions himself, which I always found pretty interesting. When you get into the early church, like second century, early second century, the early church fathers were all in 100% agreement. John wrote the book. Now there's a little bit of scholarship out there. Scholarship might be a stretch, but there's a little bit of debate that maybe someone else wrote it, particularly Lazarus. There's been a real push for Lazarus as the author of the book of John. That might be worth you going down that road sometime. I don't think there's enough internal evidence, and I think it's definitely never been supported by church history. So I can't prove to you that it's John, but we're living off of about 1900 years of church history that agreed that it was John. Now that's about the author, but look at the next stuff, because I think this is pretty interesting. Book of John's 90% unique. 9 out of every 10 things you read in the book of John never appear in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. So John has something he's trying to do. He's trying to go grab the stuff that hasn't been said about Jesus elsewhere. He's trying to tell you about it, and he's an eyewitness account to the events. And so he's saying, look, all the other stories are great, but I'm here to tell you about a few things you might not have known about before. And being 90% unique, we call that the non-synoptic gospel. I put quotes on Lake Tiberias because this is one of those things that I always forget about until I really start digging in and studying a book. John calls the Sea of Galilee Lake Tiberias. It's probably actually more geographically accurate than Sea of Galilee because the Lake Tiberias Sea of Galilee is not much bigger than this lake right out here, which is not much of a sea at all. Although most of the Gospels call it the Sea of Galilee. Interestingly enough, nobody in literature, nobody in antiquity ever called it Tiberias until about the end of the first century. That's where literature starts renaming the Sea of Galilee as Lake Tiberias. John calls it Lake Tiberias 2 times in his book, which leads us to believe, I'm just trying to give you authorship and date, okay? This leads us to believe that John's writing this deep in the first century and definitely after the fall of the temple in Jerusalem. And one of the reasons we think he's writing it after the fall of the temple in Jerusalem is because of 2 other events in the book of John. One is the fact that there are no Sadducees. And most of us just think about the Sadducees as another sect of the Pharisees. That could not be further from the truth. The Sadducees are that group of people in Israel who are at the top of the food chain spiritually. They actually take care of the day-to-day operations in the temple. And the Sadducees are probably most famous for not believing in a resurrection. But that was not what they were most famous for in their day. That's what they're most famous for in our day. They didn't believe in resurrection and they fought with Jesus all the time. But in their day, the Sadducees were famous for not believing in any oral tradition. And so for them, the only thing that mattered was what was written in the Torah. The Pharisees believed in oral tradition. So if the forefathers taught it, the Pharisees would teach it. Okay, so the Pharisees have they've got this codicil of beliefs that they've taken in that's called the Torah, that's called rabbinical tradition, that's called writings of the ancients, that's called great-great-grandfather was a high priest and he said it. Okay? That was a Pharisaical way of Judaism. And so they encompassed a bunch of stuff. Whereas the Sadducees said, no, we don't believe in any of that stuff. If it's not in the Torah, we don't believe it, we don't do it, we don't practice it. And so Jesus' arguments were always a little more vehement against the Pharisees than they were against the Sadducees, you'll notice in the text as you read the Gospels, because Jesus is fighting traditions of men a lot, and the Pharisees are stacking up traditions of men. Like where in the Old Testament does it say you can't eat till you wash your hands? Well, it's probably good Advice? Right? I mean, it's pretty good advice. Don't eat till you wash your hands. But they didn't have, their reasoning was not because it was, germy. Their reasoning was because it was unclean. And that's not in the Old Testament. There's not a scripture in the Torah that you had to wash your hands before you could consume food, though food had to be properly prepared. But so that was one of those things. The reason why there are no Sadducees is the Sadducees ended when the temple fell down. So after AD 70, there was no more Sadducees. The fact that John never mentions them is one of the most poignant, pointed internal evidences that the book of John falls post AD 70. Now, why do I bring that up? Well, because there is two things in John that is unique compared to the other Gospels. And we're going to find there's a whole bunch more than that, but there's two things odd that he leaves out. There's no hell in the book of John. If you establish your heaven and hell doctrine and use only the Gospel of John, you'll not be able to find hell because John includes no stories by Jesus in which Jesus talks of hell. He never has Jesus quote about Gehenna. He never has Jesus talk about hell as a destination or even as a present possession. He also has no Olivet Discourse. And this is unique. And the Olivet Discourse is that summarization, that speech that Jesus gives on his way to Calvary that we call prophetic or eschatological language. John has no Olivet Discourse. It's as if Jesus gives no prophecy in the book of John at all, which is interesting because that seems pretty important. I mean, if the whole end of the world issue is necessary for those of us who are going to believe on Christ, maybe there's something we need to know. I don't want to read too much into it, but I wouldn't be doing it justice if I didn't put all that stuff together to say this. John writes last. John has an agenda. And John's agenda was what? John's agenda was John 20:31. John writes these things so that you may have life in his name. And he never mentions hell. And he never mentions prophecy. And we have to ask, and maybe I don't want to push the envelope too far on that thought, but we have to ask, if you're writing a letter so that people will become believers, why would you drop the mentions of hell and the mentions of prophecy? Aren't those two of the most important things we use when we try to get people saved? Hey, you're living in the last days and you're going to burn in hell if you don't accept Christ. If we're going to write John 20, 30 and 31, we think, man, you need some hell talk and some prophecy talk. So I think it's one of the internal evidences that John, first of all, that John is writing after the fall of the temple, that the New Testament writers, when they prophetically talk about the end of time or the end of the age or the judgment that's to come, are not talking about a cataclysmic end of the world event somewhere out in your future. They're talking about a cataclysmic end of their world event in their immediate future, something that was at hand that would cause the temple to fall and the way of life that they knew from the time they were born to be gone forever. And if we're after the fall of the temple in the Gospel of John, there's a good reason why there's no prophecy. Because there's nothing to talk about. And besides, John has the book of Revelation, which is chock full of Olivet Discourse. I mean, it's the whole thing wrapped up in one big book. And so you take the internal evidences and the fact that we look at it as being the author John, and I don't want to push you into thinking one way or the other as to what that means, that if you're going to get people to believe, why would you leave these things out? Other than to say this, I was doing a podcast today in 1 Peter chapter 2, where Peter says, you have been made to say forth his praises from he who hath brought you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Okay, I didn't nail that word for word, but you have been created. You are those who bring forth his praises, having come out of darkness into the marvelous light. And it just struck me from the Spirit to hone in on what we're doing when we tell people about Jesus. We are not exposing their darkness. We are opening their eyes to light, because you don't need to open your eyes to darkness. Right? I mean, if you're opening people's eyes to darkness, they're still dark. I mean, if you got your eyes closed and it's dark, and then you open your eyes and it's still dark, opening your eyes didn't do you any good. If you're not going to put light where someone can see it, then their eyes are useless. And so when Peter says you call those out of darkness into his marvelous light, I think he's talking about this very idea that John gives, which is we believe on his name I don't have to threaten you with an afterlife. I don't have to scare you about prophecy. I just want to show you the light, and His name is Jesus. In fact, John introduces Jesus as light right out of the gate in the book of John. That Jesus is light, and He's the light of the world, and the light is the life of men.